George Washington spent 45 years cheating death. He survived the slaughter of the Monongahela, where horses were shot out from under him. He survived dysentery, malaria, and the volley fire of the British Army. He was the unkillable monument. But tonight, the monument is crumbling. He is being killed by a sore throat and the brutal ignorance of 18th century science. His doctors have turned his bedroom into an abattoir. They have drained 2.5 liters of his blood. They have fed him crushed beetles. They are carving the life out of him inch by inch while he whispers, "I die hard." He is not dying in peace. He is dying in agony. Yet the tragedy is not that he died. It is that his entire life was a rehearsal for this final suffering. The lesson began with the absence of a father. It is 1743. George is 11 years old. He stands at the edge of a grave at Ferry Farm, watching the red Virginia clay swallow the coffin of Augustine Washington. Augustine was a man of immense physical strength and significant ambition, a figure who occupied the center of George's universe. His death was the first seismic fracture in the boy's life. It wasn't just an emotional loss. It was a socio-economic catastrophe that would dictate the trajectory of George's entire adolescence. In the stratified world of colonial Virginia, the path to power and respect was paved with a classical education. The sons of gentlemen were sent across the Atlantic to the Appleby School in England. There they learned Latin, Greek rhetoric, and the subtle, unspoken codes of the British aristocracy. They returned as polished gentlemen ready to rule. George's older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., had been given this golden ticket. They were the heirs, the cosmopolitans, the men of the world. But with Augustine's death, the money dried up. The door to England slammed shut. George was left behind. Simmering resentment filled the 11-year-old boy. He watched his brothers quote Cicero and discuss London fashions, while he was left with a few dusty copybooks and the practical dirty work of the farm. He became the poor relation in his own family. He is denied the polished armor of the aristocrat. This deprivation plants a seed of deep insecurity in his chest, a feeling of intellectual inadequacy that he will carry for the rest of his life. He is painfully aware of his lack of polish. He is terrified of being seen as a rustic, a bumpkin, a fraud. So he compensates. If he cannot master Latin, he will master the physical world. If he cannot quote Greek poets, he will learn to read the land, the forests, and the mountains. He turns inward, constructing a personality built on rigid self-control. He begins to meticulously copy out rules of civility and decent behavior into his notebooks, treating social interaction not as a natural flow, but as a military campaign to be strategized. Do not speak when others are speaking. Keep your countenance pleasant. Do not show anger. He is building a mask of stone to hide the boy who felt he wasn't good enough. But there is a force far more potent than his lack of education shaping this mask. There is Mary Ball Washington. History has been kind to the mothers of great men, painting them as nurturing saints who cradled genius in their arms. Mary Ball refuses to fit this mold. She is one of the most complex, difficult, and psychologically damaging figures in the American pantheon. She was a woman of iron will, terrified of poverty, deeply suspicious of the world, and seemingly incapable of expressing maternal warmth. Widowed at 35, she did not remarry. Instead, she tightened her grip on her eldest son, George. She viewed him not as a child to be nurtured, but as a resource to be utilized. She was demanding, shrill, and perpetually dissatisfied. The dynamic at Ferry Farm was suffocating. A teenage George, towering over most grown men, and possessing a physical power that unnerved his peers, shrank in the presence of this small, pipe-smoking woman. She criticized his clothes. She criticized his ambitions. When he yearned to join the British Navy, a dream that offered escape, adventure, and a career, she crushed it. She sought advice from her brother in London, who wrote back calling the Navy a floating hellhole, and she forbade George from going. She clipped his wings before he could even test them. This relationship established the fundamental psychological architecture of George Washington. He learned early that his own desires were secondary to the demands of duty. He learned that affection was not given freely. It was withheld as a tool of control. He learned to suppress his emotions, to swallow his anger, to present a stoic, unreadable face to the world, because any display of vulnerability before his mother would be met with scorn or guilt. He became a man desperate for approval, yet terrifyingly composed because he had been trained in the hardest school of all, the parlor of Mary Ball Washington. The irony is palpable. Mary Ball Washington was the archetype of the toxic mother, yet she unintentionally created the perfect temperament for a revolutionary general. She forged a man who could endure deprivation without complaint, who could face disaster with a stone face, who could subordinate his own ego to the cause. She broke his spirit just enough to make him a vessel for the nation, but left him with a hollow space inside that no amount of public adulation could ever fill. As he entered his late teens, George sought escape from the suffocating atmosphere of his mother's house. He found it in the wilderness. He took his father's old surveying tools, heavy brass instruments that smelled of oil and adventure, and headed west. The frontier was not a place for gentlemen. It was a chaotic, violent, lawless borderland where the British Empire faded into the ancient, complex world of the Native American nations. It was here, amidst the silence of the primeval forests and the smoke of campfires, that George Washington began to construct the physical legend of himself. He slept on the ground, wrapped in a match coat, listening to the screams of panthers and the wind in the hemlocks. He ate meat carved from animals he tracked himself. He learned to move silently. He hardened his body into a weapon of endurance. The soft, insecure boy who missed out on Latin school was gone. In his place was a surveyor who could walk 20 miles a day through a swamp and map it with mathematical precision. But the wilderness gave him something else, something darker. It gave him his first brush with the fragility of the human body, a foreshadowing of the medical horror that would claim him in the end. In 1751, in a final attempt to save his dying brother Lawrence, George accompanied him to the island of Barbados. It was the only time George Washington would ever leave the North American continent. He went looking for a cure. Instead, he found a curse. The tropical air was thick with mosquitoes and disease. Within weeks of arriving, George fell ill. The headache was blinding. His back ached as if he had been beaten with clubs. Then came the fever, and finally the pustules, smallpox. The killer of the century had found him. For weeks he lay in a delirious haze, the fluid-filled blisters covering his face, turning his skin into a raw, weeping landscape of agony. The pain was absolute. Every movement was torture. He survived. But when he looked in the mirror, the smooth-skinned youth was gone. His face was pitted, marked forever by the craters of the disease. He would be self-conscious of these scars for the rest of his life, often turning his good side to painters or relying on artists to smooth over the truth. But the disease took something more than his vanity. It is almost certain that the high fever ravaged his reproductive system. The father of his country was left sterile. He would never hear the cry of his own son. He would never see his own features reflected in a daughter. The lineage of Washington would end with him. This is the hidden tragedy that walked beside him. As he grew into a man who would father a nation, he carried the private grief of a genetic dead end. It deepened his stoicism. It added a layer of melancholy to his eyes that you can see in the portraits if you look past the heroic posture. He was a man building a house that no heir of his blood would ever inhabit. So he returned from Barbados as scarred and sterile, but alive. He had danced with death and won. He did not know it then, but this was the beginning of the pattern. The universe was teaching him that he could survive anything: plague, fever, exposure. It was building the myth of invincibility, but the wilderness was not done with him. It had tested his body with disease. Now it would test his soul with violence. The year is 1753. The tension between France and Britain over the Ohio country is approaching a boiling point. The French are building forts, staking a claim to the vast, rich interior of the continent. The British governor of Virginia needs an emissary, someone tough enough to cross the winter mountains, bold enough to walk into a French fort, and diplomatic enough to deliver a beautifully phrased ultimatum: get out. He chooses George Washington. Washington is 21 years old. He is raw, ambitious, and hungry for glory. He views war not as a horror, but as a stage, a place where a man can prove his worth, earn his stripes, and perhaps finally silence the critical voice of his mother. He accepts the mission with a speed that borders on recklessness. The journey is a nightmare. 900 miles of snow, ice, and hostile terrain. He is shot at by a native guide who turns traitor. He falls off a raft into the freezing Agony River and nearly drowns, his coat freezing solid around him like a suit of iron armor. He survives only by the sheer brute force of his constitution. He returns to Virginia not just as a surveyor, but as a hero. He has faced the French and the elements and survived. But survival is one thing, command is another. In 1754, he is sent back, this time with soldiers. He is a lieutenant colonel now, commanding a ragtag regiment of Virginians. His orders are vague, his experience is nil, and his ego is massive. He is walking into a powder keg with a lit match. He camps in a place called the Great Meadows, a soggy, miserable patch of ground. His native allies, led by the intense and politically calculating Seneca chief Tanagrisan, the half-king, bring him intelligence. A party of French soldiers is camped nearby in a secluded ravine. Washington sees an opportunity. He envisions a glorious, honorable engagement, a proper European battle in the American woods. He gathers his men and marches through the rainy night, surrounding the French position at a place that will live in infamy, Jumonville Glen. What happens next is the moment George Washington loses his innocence. It is the moment the romantic fog of war evaporates, replaced by the hot copper smell of atrocity. Washington gives the order to fire. The volley tears into the sleeping French camp. Chaos erupts. The French return fire, but they are overwhelmed. Within 15 minutes, the skirmish is over. The French commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, lies wounded in the dirt. Washington steps forward, flushed with adrenaline. He begins to accept the surrender. Jumonville, bleeding, tries to explain that he is not a soldier on a raid, but a diplomat carrying a message, much like Washington had been a year earlier. He claims diplomatic immunity. He pleads for his life. Washington, struggling with the French language, tries to parse the words. The situation is tense but seemingly under control. The civilized rules of war are in play. Then the half-king steps forward. Tanagrisan has his own agenda, his own hatred for the French that runs deeper than Washington can comprehend. He looks at the wounded Frenchman. He speaks a few words in an indigenous tongue. Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père. Thou art not yet dead, my father. And then, before Washington can blink, before he can raise a hand or shout an order, the half-king raises his tomahawk and brings it down with sickening force into Jumonville's skull. The crack of bone is louder than a musket shot. Washington stands frozen. He is 22 years old. He's a gentleman. He reads books on civility. And he is watching a man's head being split open. But the horror does not end there. The half-king reaches into the shattered cranium of the dying man, scoops out a handful of warm gray brain matter, and washes his hands with it. It is a ritual of absolute contempt, a cleansing of the spirit through the defilement of the enemy. Washington stares, the blood, the brains, the steam rising from the open skull in the cool morning air. This is not the glory he read about. This is not the noble clash of arms. This is butchery. This is the primal, chaotic reality of violence. He has just inadvertently started a world war. This skirmish in a forgotten glen will ignite the 7 Years' War, a global conflagration that will burn from Europe to India to the Philippines. And it started because George Washington, the boy who wanted to be a hero, lost control of the situation. He writes a letter to his brother shortly after, a letter that reveals a disturbing disconnect, a psychological defense mechanism kicking in to protect his mind from the trauma. I heard the bullets whistle, he writes, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound. Charming. He calls the sound of death charming. It is the bravado of a young man trying to convince himself he isn't horrified. It is the mask slipping into place. He cannot admit the terror, so he romanticizes it. He transforms the gore of Jumonville Glen into a gentleman's adventure, but the universe has a way of stripping away illusions. If Jumonville Glen was a sin, the retribution would come at the Battle of the Monongahela. Flash forward to 1755. Washington is now an aide-de-camp to the British General Edward Braddock. Braddock is a bulldog of a man, arrogant, disdainful of colonial tactics, and marching a massive column of redcoats deep into the wilderness to take the French Fort Duquesne. They're walking into a slaughterhouse. On July 9th, the French and their native allies strike. They do not stand in lines like gentlemen. They dissolve into the trees. They fire from behind rocks and logs. The British column, packed tight on the narrow road, becomes a panic-stricken mob. The invisible enemy pours fire into the mass of red uniforms. It is not a battle. It is an execution. General Braddock is shot through the lung. The officers are picked off one by one. The road is a river of blood and screaming horses. And in the center of this apocalypse rides George Washington. He is weak from dysentery, having spent the previous days riding on a wagon, doubled over in pain. But as the chaos erupts, something ancient wakes up inside him. He straps pillows to his saddle to cushion his agonizing bowels and mounts his horse. He rides directly into the kill zone. Panic is contagious, but so is courage. Washington rides back and forth across the front lines, trying to rally the terrified Virginians, trying to bring order to the disintegration. He is a towering figure on a white horse, the perfect target. A musket ball shears through his hat. Another tears through his coat. A horse collapses under him, blood spurting from its neck. He scrambles up, shaking the dust off, and mounts a second horse. Moments later, that horse is shot out from under him, too. He is covered in mud, blood, and gunpowder soot. Men are dying on his left and right. The air is thick with lead bees buzzing and stinging. He should be dead. Statistically, he must be dead, but he keeps riding. He is in a trance of command, a state of hyper-focus where fear does not exist. He organizes the retreat. He saves the remnants of the army from total annihilation. When the sun sets and the screaming finally stops, Washington dismounts. He is exhausted. He takes off his coat. He holds it up to the firelight. There are 4 holes, 4 distinct ragged tears where musket balls pass through the fabric, mere inches from his ribs, his heart, his lungs. He runs his hands over his body. There is no blood. There is no pain. He is untouched. It is this moment that seals his fate. It is this moment that convinces the world, and perhaps Washington himself, that he is set apart. A native chief who fought in the battle would later recount a prophecy. I called to my young men and said, "Mark yon tall and daring warrior. He is not of the redcoat tribe. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies." Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for him, knew not how to miss. But it was all in vain. A power mightier than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. He cannot die in battle. The words settle around him like a shroud. He has survived the toxic mother. He has survived the smallpox. He has survived the massacre of Jumonville and the slaughter of the Monongahela. He is the indestructible man. But deep inside, the physical toll is mounting. The dysentery has weakened his gut. The stress is hardening his arteries. The invincible coat is just wool, and the body underneath is merely flesh, waiting for the one enemy that bullets cannot stop. As he rides away from the smoking ruins of Braddock's army, George Washington is a hero. But he is also a man alone, bearing the weight of a survival he cannot explain, moving inexorably toward a destiny that will demand everything he has. And then in a cold bedroom 44 years later, will take the rest. The bullets had missed him. The French had failed to kill him. The fever had failed to burn him out. George Washington returned from the frontier in 1758, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, carrying the invisible weight of a man who suspects he has been spared for a purpose he cannot yet see. He resigned his commission in the Virginia militia with a bitterness that tasted like bile. He had sought a commission in the regular British Army, the Royal Commission that would have cemented his status as a true gentleman and equal to the arrogant officers who sneered at his colonial uniform. The British rejected him. To them, he was just a provincial surveyor with a talent for surviving disasters he helped create. He retreated to Mount Vernon, determined to build a fortress where the world could not touch him. He would become a farmer. He would become rich. He would become the master of his own universe. But a fortress needs a queen, and a dynasty needs heirs. In January 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a widow, wealthy beyond imagination, bringing with her thousands of acres of land and nearly 300 enslaved human beings. Overnight, George Washington became one of the richest men in Virginia. History paints this marriage as a dignified, respectable partnership. Portraits depict the portly, kind-faced Martha and the tall, protective George, suggesting a domestic idol. But beneath the layers of domestic bliss lay a relationship defined by a profound shared silence, a silence about the children who weren't there. Martha brought 2 children into the marriage from her previous husband, Jackie and Patsy. Washington adopted them instantly. He ordered toys for them from London. He fretted over their education. He clothed them in the finest silks. He was a devoted, obsessive father figure. But they were not his. The tragedy of the smallpox in Barbados now came full circle. As the years ticked by at Mount Vernon, the cradle remained empty of a Washington heir. The man who was obsessed with legacy, who meticulously designed his own uniforms and managed his estate down to the last seed, could not manage the one thing that mattered most to a patriarch: reproduction. He was the father of his country, but he was genetically a dead end. This reality gnawed at him. In his letters, he occasionally let the mask slip, referring to himself as having no issue. It was a failure of the flesh. While his brothers and neighbors were raising boisterous broods of Washingtons, George walked the halls of Mount Vernon surrounded by the ghosts of the children he could never have. He poured that frustrated energy into his stepchildren, but tragedy, it seemed, was determined to hunt him down, even in his sanctuary. His stepdaughter Patsy was a gentle, fragile girl. Washington adored her, but she suffered from a terrifying affliction, epilepsy. In the 18th century, epilepsy was a mystery, a curse, a storm in the brain that struck without warning. For years, George and Martha tried everything. They hired quack doctors who prescribed Fitz drops and strange metallic rings. They tried bloodletting. They tried mercury. Nothing worked. On a summer afternoon in 1773, the horror arrived at the dinner table. Patsy, now a teenager, had just finished a meal. She stood up, smiled, and then collapsed. It wasn't a normal seizure. It was the end. Washington fell to his knees beside her. This giant of a man, who had ridden through cannon fire without blinking, was reduced to utter helplessness. He held her as she convulsed, timing the seizures with his watch, praying to a God he was never quite sure was listening. In less than 2 minutes, she was dead in his arms. She was 17. Washington's diary entry for that day is a masterpiece of repressed agony. She rose from dinner about 4 o'clock in better health and spirits than she appeared to have been in for some time, soon after which she was seized with one of her usual fits and expired in it in less than 2 minutes without uttering a word, a groan, or a sigh. Clinical, precise, detached. The mask was back in place, but inside, something hardened. He had learned another brutal lesson. You cannot protect the things you love. The only way to survive is to endure. As he buried his stepdaughter, the world outside Mount Vernon was catching fire. The relationship between the colonies and Great Britain was rotting, much like Washington's own body. By the early 1770s, Washington was experiencing the first throes of the dental agony that would torture him for the rest of his life. His teeth were decaying rapidly, falling out one by one, leaving inflamed, pus-filled gums. He was in constant throbbing pain. It is a perfect, grotesque metaphor. As the body politic of the British Empire decayed, so did the mouth of the man destined to destroy it. When the call to war finally came in 1775, Washington did not leap for joy. He did not deliver a fiery speech from a balcony. He sat in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, wearing his old military uniform, a silent, towering billboard for his own candidacy, but when the job of commander-in-chief was offered, he hesitated. This was not the brash boy of Jumonville Glen. This was a 43-year-old man who knew exactly what war looked like. He knew it was dysentery and amputation and starvation. He knew the British Army was the deadliest machine on earth. He accepted the command with a fatal flaw confession that sounds almost like a plea for forgiveness in advance. He told Congress, "I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." Imposter syndrome. The most powerful man in American history began his greatest task believing he wasn't good enough to do it. He wrote to Martha, "I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it." He wasn't lying. He was leaving his wife in her grief, leaving his estate and riding north to Boston to take command of a rabble. He was riding toward the greatest humiliation of his life. If 1775 was the year of waiting, 1776 was the year of the slaughter. Washington moved his army to New York City. It was a strategic trap, an island city impossible to defend without a navy, and Washington had no navy. In August 1776, the British hammer fell. They landed 32,000 troops, the largest expeditionary force in the history of the British Empire, on Long Island. They were professionals, Hessians with waxed mustaches and sharpened bayonets, Highlanders with broadswords, grenadiers who stood 6 feet tall. Washington had 19,000 men. Most were farmers. Many had no shoes. Some had no muskets, armed only with spears or rusted fowling pieces. They were sick, undisciplined, and terrified. The Battle of Long Island was not a battle, it was a fox hunt. The British outflanked Washington with embarrassing ease. They drove the Americans into the swamps. The Hessians, renowned for their brutality, skewered, surrendering Americans to trees with their bayonets. Washington watched from a fortified height in Brooklyn as his army was chewed to pieces. "Good God," he wept, wringing his hands, "what brave fellows I must this day lose." It was a total, humiliating disaster. He only escaped annihilation by a miracle of weather, a dense fog that rolled in, allowing him to evacuate his army across the East River in the dead of night. But the psychological blow was devastating. The Indestructible Man was being beaten, and then came Kip's Bay. On September 15, 1776, the British landed at Kip's Bay in Manhattan. The American militia panicked. They didn't just retreat, they dissolved. They threw down their muskets and ran like frightened rabbits before the British had even closed within firing range. Washington rode into the rout. He was thunderstruck. He had spent his life cultivating discipline, honor, and courage. And here were his countrymen, acting like cowards. The control snapped. The mask shattered. Washington drew his sword. He didn't ride against the British. He rode against his own men. He cursed them. He struck them with the flat of his sword. He whipped them with his riding cane. He drew his pistols and threatened to blow their brains out if they didn't stand and fight. "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" he screamed, hurling his hat onto the ground in a tantrum of despair. He was so consumed by blind rage, so paralyzed by the shame of their cowardice, that he sat frozen on his horse within 80 yards of the advancing British infantry. He stared at the enemy, essentially inviting them to shoot him. He wanted to die. In that moment, death was preferable to the dishonor of leading an army of cowards. An aide-de-camp had to grab the bridle of his horse and forcibly drag the commander-in-chief off the battlefield. It was a moment of absolute collapse. The father of the country, catatonic with rage, had to be dragged away from suicide by enemy fire because he could not bear the reality of failure. The months that followed were a slow-motion funeral for the American Revolution. Washington retreated and retreated and retreated across the Hudson, across New Jersey. The army was melting away. Deserters left in droves, taking their muskets with them. The term of enlistment for the few remaining soldiers was set to expire on December 31st. By December, Washington had fewer than 3,000 men left. They were starving. They were wrapped in blankets because their coats had rotted off. They left a trail of blood on the snow because they had no shoes. Washington was writing letters to his brother that sounded like a last will and testament. "I think the game is pretty near up," he wrote. He privately confessed that he expected to be captured and hanged. He touched his neck, imagining the noose. The British were so confident the war was over that their general, William Howe, packed his bags to spend the winter in New York with his mistress. But it is in the deepest pits of despair that the strange alchemy of George Washington's character finally solidified. Stripped of his pride, stripped of his illusions of honorable warfare, stripped of the hope of a conventional victory, Washington stopped trying to be a British gentleman. He stopped trying to fight a European war. He tapped back into the primal survival instincts of the wilderness surveyor. If he couldn't beat them, he would outlast them. If he couldn't fight them in the open, he would murder them in their sleep. He devised a plan that was not brilliant military strategy. It was an act of desperation, a suicide mission. He would take his broken, freezing, dying army across the ice-choked Delaware River in the middle of a hurricane and attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton on Christmas night. The night of December 25th, 1776 was a horror show. The temperature plummeted. The sleet turned to snow, then to hail. The wind screamed. Washington stood in the lead boat. This was not a pose. He stood because the boats were awash with freezing water, and to sit was to freeze to death. He watched the ice floes smash against the hulls. He watched his men wrapped in rags, shivering so violently the boats vibrated. He knew the odds. If they failed, the river would be their grave. If they failed, the revolution ended that night. They landed on the Jersey shore hours behind schedule. The gunpowder in their muskets was wet. "Use the bayonet," Washington ordered. "I am resolved to take Trenton." They marched 9 miles to the town. 2 men froze to death on the road. They just sat down in the snow and died. Washington marched past them. There was no time to mourn. At dawn, they struck. The Hessians, groggy and completely unprepared for an army of ghosts to emerge from a blizzard, were overwhelmed. It wasn't a battle. It was a brawl. In less than an hour, Washington captured 900 prisoners. He lost no one to enemy fire. It was the miracle that saved the war. But for Washington, it was the moment he realized the true nature of the beast he was riding. This would not be a war of glory. It would be a war of endurance, a war of suffering. He realized that to win, he didn't have to destroy the British army. He just had to keep his own army from dying. He had to be the indestructible man, not for himself, but for them. But the cost of that endurance was being carved into his flesh. The stress was eating him alive. The dental agony was worsening. His eyesight was failing. The irony was sharpening its blade. The man who saved the nation could not save himself from the slow grinding disintegration of his own body. As the war dragged on into 1777, 1778, the winter at Valley Forge loomed. And there, amidst the starvation and the smallpox, Washington would face a threat far more dangerous than the British: the betrayal of his own friends. The miracle of Trenton bought them time, but it did not buy them salvation. As the adrenaline of victory faded, the reality of the war settled back onto George Washington's shoulders like a leaden cloak. The years that followed, 1777, 1778, were not a march to glory. They were a descent into a specific kind of hell, a test of endurance that stripped the last vestiges of romanticism from the American Revolution. If the war began with the explosive violence of gunpowder, it was now being fought with the silent, grinding weapons of starvation, disease, and political treachery. The indestructible man was about to find that the sharpest knives were not held by British redcoats, but by the men smiling at him from across the dinner table. The winter of 1777 brought the Continental Army to a plateau of suffering known as Valley Forge. History books often sanitize this place, painting it as a snowy backdrop for patriotic stoicism. The reality was a horror show of logistical incompetence and biological decomposition. It was a city of 12,000 men built in weeks, with no sanitation, no food supply, and no winter clothing. Within days, the camps smelled of death. The latrines overflowed. Horses died of starvation and were left to rot where they fell, their carcasses bloating in the thaw and freezing in the frost. The men were ghosts. Witness accounts describe soldiers with no trousers, wrapping their frostbitten legs in blankets, leaving bloody footprints on the crusted snow as they marched to picket duty. They boiled leather shoes to drink the broth. They ate fire cakes, a mixture of flour and water cooked on a rock that turned into cement in their guts. Washington lived in a stone house at the center of this misery, and the guilt ate him alive. He bombarded Congress with letters, pleading, screaming for supplies. "You cannot expect men to fight on empty stomachs," he wrote, his pen scratching furiously against the parchment. But Congress, safe and warm in York, Pennsylvania, did nothing. They debated, they bickered, they speculated on whether Washington was truly the right man for the job. While his men were literally rotting in the snow, the politicians were sharpening their quills to stab him in the back. This was the Conway Cabal, a whisper campaign orchestrated by jealous generals and ambitious politicians to replace Washington with Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga. They called Washington a Fabius, a general who only knew how to retreat. They mocked his idolatry. For a man whose entire psychological architecture was built on the desperate need for approval and honor, this was torture. Washington knew about the whispers. He saw the letters. He sat in his freezing headquarters, his teeth aching in his inflamed gums, reading the treason of his peers. He did not explode in rage as he had at Kip's Bay. He went cold. He retreated behind the mask of ice. He understood now that he was alone. The father had no friends, only dependents and rivals. He responded to the conspiracy with a silence so profound, a dignity so crushing, that the plot eventually collapsed under the weight of his own moral authority. He shamed them into submission not by fighting back, but by simply enduring. But the greatest threat at Valley Forge was not the cold, nor the hunger, nor the politicians. It was the invisible killer, smallpox. The virus was surging again, threatening to liquidate the army faster than the British ever could. Washington faced a decision that was medically terrifying. He could watch his army die, or he could gamble everything on a radical, controversial procedure known as variolation. In the 18th century, before the invention of the vaccine, variolation involved taking live pusa and scab matter from a smallpox victim, thick yellow, teeming with the virus, and slicing it directly into an open wound of a healthy person. The hope was that the patient would develop a mild case and survive with immunity. The risk was that it would simply trigger a full-blown epidemic and kill everyone. Washington ordered the mass inoculation of the Continental Army. It was a secret operation, a biological gamble of staggering proportions. Surgeons moved down lines of terrified, emaciated soldiers, slicing their arms with unwashed lancets, smearing the infected matter into their blood. Men groaned in fever tents, the smell of sickness hanging heavy in the air. Washington walked among them, watching the process with a hawk's eye. He was playing God with the lives of his men, and he won. The death rate plummeted. The army emerged from the winter not only alive, but immune. It was his greatest strategic victory of the war, and not a single shot was fired. He had defeated the microscopic enemy even as his own body continued to betray him. The war dragged on. Years turned into a blur of skirmishes, stalemates, and the endless gnawing hunger for money that Congress refused to print. Washington aged rapidly. His hair turned snow white. His eyesight began to fail, the world blurring at the edges. The dental agony became a constant, throbbing background noise to his existence. By 1781, the victory at Yorktown finally came. A brilliant, decisive trap sprung on Lord Cornwallis. The world turned upside down. The British surrendered. But for Washington, the end of the fighting did not bring peace. It brought the most dangerous moment of the entire revolution, a moment where the Republic almost died in its cradle and was saved only by the physical frailty of its leader. It is March 1783. The war is technically won, but the peace treaty has not been signed. The army is camped at Newburgh, New York. They have not been paid in years. They are angry. They have bled for a nation that now treats them like beggars. A dangerous sentiment is boiling over: mutiny. The officers are circulating a letter, the Newburgh address, calling for the army to march on Congress, to take their pay at the point of a bayonet, to seize control. They want Washington to lead them. They want to make him king. And if he refuses, they are ready to push him aside. Washington hears the rumbling. He knows that if the army revolts, the experiment of democracy is over. We will simply trade a British king for an American military dictator. He calls a meeting at the Temple of Virtue, a large wooden hall in the camp. On March 15th, hundreds of angry, hardened officers pack the room. The atmosphere is toxic. They look at Washington not with adoration, but with cold, hostile eyes. He is the obstacle standing between them and their money. Washington walks to the podium. He looks old. He tries to read a prepared speech appealing to their patriotism, their honor. "Gentlemen," he begins, but the words fall flat. The room is silent, stony. They have heard the speeches before. They want gold, not rhetoric. Washington feels the room slipping away. He can feel the violence coiling in the air, ready to strike. He falters. He realizes his arguments are not working. Then he remembers a letter he brought from a congressman, promising that payment would eventually come. He reaches into his pocket to retrieve it. He unfolds the paper, but the handwriting is tiny, and the light in the barn is dim. He squints. He moves the paper back and forth. He cannot read it. The indestructible man, the hawk-eyed surveyor, is blind. The silence in the room grows uncomfortable. The officers watch their general struggle. It is a moment of pathetic vulnerability. Washington pauses. He sighs, a heavy, weary sound that echoes in the rafters. He reaches into his waistcoat pocket and pulls out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He has essentially never worn them in public. To these men, he is a god, a statue, a force of nature. Gods do not wear spectacles. Gods do not have failing eyes. He fumbles to put them on, his large hands shaking slightly. As he adjusts the frames on his nose, he looks up at the sea of angry faces and speaks, not from the script, but from the heart. "Gentlemen," he says softly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The sentence hangs in the air. It is a thunderclap of intimacy. In one sentence, he strips away the rank, the uniform, the legend. He tells them, "I am tired, I am broken. I've given my eyes, my youth, my health for this, for you." The anger in the room evaporates instantly. Hardened veterans, men who have bayoneted Hessians and watched their friends die in the mud, begin to weep openly. The sight of their father figure admitting his own mortality shatters their resolve to mutiny. They are ashamed. The coup is over. Washington has saved the Republic not with his strength, but with his weakness. He reads the letter, folds his glasses, and leaves the room to the sound of sobbing. Months later, on December 23, 1783, Washington performs the final act of his impossible script. He stands before Congress in Annapolis. The war is over. The power is his. He could be Caesar. He could be Cromwell. He could be King George I of America. The world expects him to keep the sword. Power is never given up voluntarily. Washington takes his commission, the piece of paper that gives him command of the armies, and hands it back. His hands are trembling so much he has to hold the paper with both hands to keep it steady. "I resign with satisfaction. The appointment I accepted with diffidence," he says. He bows and walks out. King George III, hearing of this in London, says if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. He rides home to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve. He believes he is done. He believes he has survived. He imagines the rest of his life will be spent under his own vine and fig tree, watching the Potomac roll by, safe from the public eye. But he is wrong. The irony is not finished with him. The indestructible man has survived the bullets and the smallpox, but he is carrying a ticking time bomb in his own skull. The dental nightmare is entering its terminal phase, and the nation he saved is about to drag him back into the light, demanding one last sacrifice that will cost him his peace, his health, and ultimately, his life. The farm is not a sanctuary, it is a waiting room, and the doctors are already sharpening their tools. The peace of Mount Vernon was a hallucination. George Washington had returned to his estate in December 1783, believing he had crossed the finish line of his public life. He told the Marquis de Lafayette that he was now a private citizen who would move gently down the stream of life until he slept with his fathers. He envisioned a quiet existence of crop rotation, manure experimentation, and the slow rhythmic expansion of his mansion. But the man who had mastered the geography of the battlefield could not navigate the geography of his own fame. The world would not let him be a farmer. Visitors flocked to Mount Vernon like pilgrims to a shrine, strangers, veterans, artists, politicians, eating his food, drinking his wine, and staring at the living monument. He was a prisoner in his own home, trapped by the very celebrity he had spent a lifetime cultivating. But the true prison was not the constant stream of guests. It was the crumbling structure of the nation he had helped birth. The Articles of Confederation were failing. The states were bickering like petulant children. The economy was collapsing. Shays's rebellion in Massachusetts, a revolt of angry, indebted farmers, terrified the ruling class. They saw anarchy on the horizon. They needed a symbol of authority to anchor the drifting ship. They needed the indestructible man. In 1787, the call came to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Washington resisted. He claimed rheumatism. He claimed a desire for privacy. He wrote that he had bid adieu to the public walks of life. But the pull of duty and the terrifying fear that his legacy would be destroyed if the nation collapsed was too strong. He rode north again, his body aching, his mood dark. He presided over the convention in a silence that was both calculated and terrified. For 4 sweltering months, while the delegates debated the architecture of the future American government, Washington sat in the high chair, saying almost nothing. He knew his presence alone was the argument. He was the unspoken model for the executive branch. When they wrote the president, they were picturing him. But while he sat there, stone-faced and majestic, he was hiding a physical torment that was rapidly becoming unbearable. The wooden teeth myth is perhaps the most persistent and sanitized lie in American history. It suggests a rustic, almost charming simplicity. The reality was a grotesque Gothic horror story involving grave robbing, human exploitation, and constant blinding pain. By the time Washington was elected the first president of the United States in 1789, his mouth was a graveyard. He had one solitary natural tooth left, a lower left premolar that anchored the entire contraption of his artificial jaw. The dentures he wore were not wood. Wood would have rotted in a week. They were technological nightmares constructed from lead, brass, gold wire, cow teeth, hippopotamus ivory, and, most chillingly, human teeth. But whose teeth? In Washington's meticulously kept ledgers, there is an entry from May 1784 that reads, "By Cash PD Negroes, for 9 teeth on act of Dr. Lemayeur." Dr. Jean-Pierre Lemayeur was a French dentist and a frequent guest at Mount Vernon. He specialized in tooth transplantation, a gruesome, mostly failed procedure where a fresh tooth was ripped from a healthy donor and jammed into the bleeding socket of a wealthy patient. The donors were often the enslaved. George Washington, The man who was writing the blueprint for human liberty was chewing his meals with teeth purchased for a pittance from the mouths of the human beings he owned. It is a visceral, horrifying realization. The mouth that swore the first oath of office was a mosaic of exploitation. The mechanics of these dentures were an instrument of torture. The upper and lower sets were connected by heavy coiled metal springs at the back of the jaw. These springs constantly pushed the plates apart. This meant that to keep his mouth closed, Washington had to actively clench his jaw muscles every second of the day. If he relaxed for even a moment, his mouth would snap open. Imagine the physical toll. The constant muscle tension caused severe headaches and changed the shape of his face. The lower jaw protruded, giving him that grim, heavy-set look we see in the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait, the Athenaeum portrait that is on the dollar bill. That is not the look of noble resolve. That is the face of a man in agony, struggling to keep a spring-loaded trap shut. The dentures fit poorly. They rubbed raw spots on his gums that turned into ulcers. The ivory was porous and absorbed the bacteria of his mouth, rotting over time and emitting a foul, decaying smell. Washington had to soak them in port wine to mask the stench, which eventually stained the ivory black. He spoke less and less, not because he was the strong, silent type, but because speaking was a physical battle against the springs and the pain. He was terrified of the dentures slipping or clacking while he delivered a speech. The voice of the new nation was strangled by its own prosthetics. It was with this mouth full of metal and ghosts that he accepted the presidency. He did not want it. On his way to New York for the inauguration in April 1789, he wrote to Henry Knox, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied by feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution." He felt like a man marching to the gallows, and the execution almost happened sooner than anyone expected. Weeks after taking office, a malignant tumor, likely an anthrax carbuncle, appeared on his thigh. It grew rapidly, turning black and necrotic. The pain was excruciating. The doctors, fearing gangrene would set in and kill the president before the government was even fully formed, decided to operate. In an era before anesthesia, they strapped the 67-year-old man to a table and sliced the tumor out of his leg, carving deep into the muscle. For weeks, ropes were strung across the street outside his house to stop carriages from passing, so the noise wouldn't disturb the dying president. He lay in a fever delirium, the new government paralyzed, waiting for the indestructible man to finally break. He survived. Again. He limped back to his desk, dragging his healing leg, only to be hit the following year by a virulent bout of pneumonia that nearly suffocated him. "I have already had within less than a year 2 severe attacks," he wrote, "the last worse than the first." He was beginning to see the presidency not as a crowning achievement, but as a physical curse. The political landscape was just as brutal as the medical one. Washington had hoped to govern as a patriot king, above the fray of partisanship. Instead, he found himself trapped in the crossfire between his 2 brilliant sons, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. They hated each other with a venomous passion. Jefferson, the Francophile agrarian, saw Hamilton as a monarchist tyrant. Hamilton, the Anglophile financier, saw Jefferson as a chaotic anarchist. Washington, the tired father, tried to mediate, but the rift tore his cabinet apart. The press, unleashed by the very freedoms Washington had fought for, turned on him. They called him a hypocrite. They mocked his monarchical style, his formal levees, his cream-colored carriage, his bowing. Instead of shaking hands, they accused him of senility. Benjamin Franklin Bache, in the Aurora, wrote that the nation had been debauched by Washington. Thomas Paine, the voice of the Revolution, wrote an open letter from France calling Washington treacherous in private friendship and a hypocrite in public life. This broke him in a way the British muskets never could. He was thin-skinned. He collected the newspaper clippings, reading the insults with a masochistic fixation. At one cabinet meeting, Jefferson recorded that Washington exploded in a rage, slamming the table and shouting that, by God, he would rather be in his grave than in his present situation. He shouted that he would rather be a farmer than the emperor of the world. The indestructible man was hollowed out. He was physically deteriorating, his hearing fading, his back bent, his mouth a cavern of pain. He looked at the calendar, counting the days until he could escape. In 1796, he published his farewell address. It was not a speech delivered to Congress, but a letter to the people printed in the newspapers. It was a warning. He warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. He warned against foreign entanglements. It was the advice of a dying father to squabbling children, telling them that their inheritance was fragile, and they were on the verge of squandering it. On March 4, 1797, he attended the inauguration of John Adams. He was dressed in black velvet. He looked, observers noted, radiant, not with power but with relief. He was shedding the burden. As he walked out of the hall, a private citizen once more, the crowd followed him, leaving the new president alone. They cheered, and for the first time in years, tears streamed down Washington's scarred, pockmarked face. He returned to Mount Vernon a wreck. He was 65. His teeth were gone. His hearing was going. His body was a map of scars. He had given 45 years to the service of others. He had realized the terrible truth of power. It consumes the vessel that holds it. He had freed the country, but he had never been free himself. He had 2 years left to live, and as he rode his horse through the Virginia woods, inspecting his fences, trying to salvage his neglected finances, the final irony was waiting in the clouds gathering over the Potomac. The indestructible man had survived the wars of men. Now he would have to face the war of nature, armed only with doctors who believed that blood was a poison to be drained. The stage was set for the final act. The place of execution he had feared in 1789 was not the presidency. It was his own bedroom. The calendar turned to 1797, and the indestructible man returned to the banks of the Potomac, believing he had finally outrun history. He was now a private citizen, stripped of the titles of general and president, left only with the name he was born with. He was 65 years old, a towering white-haired relic of a century that was rapidly fading. To the outside world, this was the happy ending, the Cincinnatus returning to his plow, the sage of Mount Vernon resting under his vine and fig tree. But peace for George Washington was a foreign country he could never quite colonize. The reality of his retirement was not a pastoral idyll. It was a frantic, desperate race against bankruptcy. The years of public service had devastated his personal fortune. While he was freezing at Valley Forge and suffering in the president's house in Philadelphia, his farms had been mismanaged, his crops had failed, and his soil had been exhausted. He was land rich but cash poor, owning thousands of acres of wilderness he couldn't sell, and hundreds of enslaved workers he couldn't afford to feed, yet refused to sell due to a growing, complicated moral revulsion toward the institution of slavery. So the old soldier did not rest. He attacked his retirement with the same manic, disciplined intensity he had applied to the British Army. He woke before dawn. He rode 15 to 20 miles a day, every day, supervising the planting, the milling, the fishing, and the distilling. He was trying to rebuild a collapsing empire of dirt. He was driven by a terrified need for control, the ghost of his mother's voice, perhaps still whispering that poverty was a sin, that idleness was a vice. Physically, he remained a marvel. Despite the dentures that tortured his gums, despite the fading hearing and the rheumy eyes, his constitution was still ironclad. Visitors marveled at how the general sat a horse, straight as a ramrod, graceful, powerful. He looked like a man who could live to be 100. He had survived the smallpox, the dysentery, the malaria, the pneumonia, the anthrax tumor, and the bullets. He had developed a fatal arrogance about his own health, a belief that his body was a fortress that could weather any siege. He did not know that the siege engines were already at the gate, and they came not in the form of an army, but in the form of the weather. December 1799 was a miserable month in Northern Virginia. The skies were a bruised purple, heavy with unshed winter. The temperature fluctuated wildly, a dangerous cycle of freezing and thawing that turned the roads to sludge and the air to ice. On the morning of Thursday, December 12th, Washington awoke to a grim sky. The thermometer stood at 30 degrees. The wind was picking up from the northeast, carrying the scent of a storm. A younger man, or a wiser man, might have looked out the window, seen the gathering gloom, and decided to stay by the fire with a book. But George Washington was a creature of duty. His routine was his religion. He had fences to inspect. He had trees to mark for cutting. He mounted his horse and rode out into the gray morning. Around 10 a.m., the sky opened up. It began as snow, thick and wet. Then as the temperature shifted, it turned to hail, pelting his face like musket balls. Finally, it settled into a cold, driving rain that soaked through the heavy wool of his greatcoat. For 5 hours, the 67-year-old man rode through this freezing slurry. He did not seek shelter. He did not turn back. He was the man who had crossed the Delaware in a hurricane. What was a little Virginia rain to the indestructible man? He ignored the water trickling down his collar, ignored the chills seeping into his bones. He was proving to himself and to the elements that he was still the master of his environment. He returned to the mansion house around 3 p.m. The house was warm, smelling of wood smoke and roasting meat. Dinner was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. Washington was a man of obsessive punctuality. He despised lateness. He looked at the clock. He was on time, but he was soaked to the skin. His hair was plastered to his skull, white strands matted with snow and rain. His coat was heavy with water. His secretary, Tobias Lear, looked at him with concern. He noticed snow clinging to the general's hair and cravat. He suggested, perhaps gently, that the general should change his clothes before dinner. Here, the tragedy pivots on a single, trivial decision, a decision born of vanity, stubbornness, and habit. Washington looked at the clock. If he went upstairs to change into dry silk and velvet, he would be late for dinner. The soup would be cold. The routine would be broken. "No," he said, "my greatcoat has kept me dry." It was a lie he told to maintain the image of invulnerability. He sat down at the table in his wet, freezing clothes. He ate his dinner, the damp wool steaming slightly in the warmth of the dining room, the cold moisture acting like a slow poison against his chest and throat. By the time he finally changed into dry clothes later that evening, the damage was done. The fortress had been breached. The next day, Friday, December the 13th, broke with heavy snow covering the ground. Washington woke with a scratchy throat. It was a minor annoyance, nothing more. A tickle. He ignored it. The snow was 3 inches deep. The prudent choice would have been to stay inside, but Washington saw that the snow had stopped and decided to go out again. He walked to the lawn to mark some trees for removal. He trudged through the drifts, the cold air rasping against his already inflamed throat. His voice was beginning to deepen, acquiring a hoarse, gravelly quality. That evening, the irony began to close its grip. The man who had spent his life shaping the news of the world sat in his parlor, trying to read the newspapers aloud to Martha and Tobias Lear. He wanted to read them the debates from the Virginia General Assembly, politics, the legacy, the future. But his voice failed him. It cracked, it rasped. He struggled to get the words out, the famous commanding baritone reduced to a wet whisper. Martha, worried, looked at him over her knitting. "You should take something for that cold," she said. She suggested a mixture of molasses and vinegar, a common folk remedy. Washington shook his head. He smiled, a grimace of the lips over the painful dentures. "No," he rasped. "You know I never take anything for a cold. Let it go as it came." Let it go as it came. It was the credo of the Stoic. Endure. Ignore the pain. It had worked at the Monongahela. It had worked at Valley Forge. It had worked when they cut the tumor from his leg. He believed that his body would simply fight this off, as it had fought off everything else. He did not know that this was not a cold. Deep inside his neck, in the delicate cartilage of the epiglottis, the lid that covers the windpipe, a bacterial colony was exploding. Streptococcus, perhaps, or Haemophilus influenzae. It was multiplying with terrifying speed, fueled by the cold and the exhaustion of his immune system. The tissue was beginning to swell. It was turning angry, red, and bulbous. Slowly, inexorably, the airway was narrowing. The path for oxygen was becoming a slit. Washington went to bed that night feeling heavy. He climbed into the high four-poster bed beside Martha. The room was cold, the fire dying down in the grate. He closed his eyes, expecting to wake up in the morning and ride out to the farms again. He was wrong. He was entering the final battlefield. The rider in the snow had delivered him to the executioner. The indestructible man had eaten his last meal. As the clock ticked past midnight, moving into the early hours of December 14th, the silence of Mount Vernon was shattered. The tragedy of the fatal supper was over. The horror of the medical torture was about to begin. The sanctuary of the master bedroom transformed instantly into a cage. As the clock on the mantelpiece ticked past 2 a.m, the darkness was absolute, save for the dying embers in the hearth. But the silence was broken by a sound that is the primal nightmare of every human being, the sound of a man fighting for oxygen. It started as a wheeze, a high-pitched musical whistling deep in the throat. Then it became a rattle, then a gasp. Washington awoke in the blackness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to take a deep breath, but the air wouldn't come. It was as if an invisible hand had reached down his throat and clamped shut over his windpipe. He sat up, panic flaring in the chest of the indestructible man. He tried to swallow. He couldn't. The muscles of his throat seized in a violent spasm. The simple, unconscious act of clearing one's throat had become an impossibility. He was drowning on dry land. Beside him lay Martha, sleeping soundly. A normal man, terrified and suffocating, would have shaken his wife awake instantly. He would have shouted for help. But George Washington was not a normal man. He was a prisoner of his own legendary consideration for others. He knew Martha had been recovering from a cold herself. He knew she was tired. And so, in a display of stoicism that borders on the pathological, he chose to lie there in the dark, gasping, sweating, and terrified for 3 hours, rather than disturb her sleep. The agony of those 3 hours was absolute. The father of his country clutched the bed sheets, eyes wide in the dark, measuring each shallow sip of air, waiting for the dawn, while the bacteria in his throat multiplied and the swelling expanded, stealing his life inch by inch. It was his fatal flaw in action, the rigid control, the refusal to show weakness, The excessive politeness that would cost him precious time. Finally, around 6 a.m., the winter sun began to bleed gray light through the windows. Martha woke up. She turned to her husband and was greeted by a sight of horror. The giant was feverish, his face flushed, struggling to breathe. When he tried to speak, the booming voice that had commanded the Continental Army was gone. In its place was a choked, garbled whisper. "I cannot breathe," he rasped. Panic erupted. Martha sprang from the bed. She called for her maid, Carolyn. She ordered a fire to be lit. She sent for Tobias Lear, the faithful secretary. Lear rushed into the room, expecting perhaps a morning briefing or a list of tasks. Instead, he found the general propped up in bed, his breathing a terrifying wet stridor. Washington, even in his distress, was trying to manage the situation. He whispered orders. He wanted his overseer, George Rawlins, and he wanted him to bring the lancets. Washington had a simple, mechanical view of the human body. He believed, as most men of the 18th century did, that illness was caused by an imbalance of the humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If the body was inflamed, it meant there was too much blood. The pressure had to be released. It was hydraulic logic applied to biology. While they waited for the overseer, Lear tried to comfort the general. He suggested a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter, a thick, syrupy concoction meant to soothe a sore throat. It was a fatal mistake. Washington nodded weakly. He opened his mouth. Lear poured a spoonful of the mixture in. The reaction was immediate and violent. The moment the liquid hit the swollen, angry tissue of the epiglottis, Washington's throat slammed shut entirely. He convulsed. He threw his head back, his hands clawing at the air, his face turning a dark, congested purple. He was choking to death. The liquid couldn't go down, and the air couldn't get in. For a few terrifying seconds, the indestructible man hovered on the brink of death right there, killed by a spoonful of molasses. Finally, with a convulsive heave, he coughed the mixture back up, gasping for air, exhausted and trembling. "Do not try that again," he whispered. The fear in the room spiked. This was not a cold. This was a monster. At 7:30 a.m., George Rawlins arrived. Rawlins was the estate overseer, a man accustomed to bleeding livestock and occasionally the enslaved workers. He was not a doctor. He stood by the bed holding the sharp steel lancet, his hand shaking. He looked down at the man he revered, the master of Mount Vernon, the most powerful man in America. He was terrified to cut him. But Washington was impatient. The pressure in his throat was unbearable. He bared his arm, the white skin contrasting with the feverish flush of his face. "Don't be afraid," Washington rasped, seeing the overseer's hesitation. "Make the cut." Rawlins steeled himself. He pressed the lancet into the vein of Washington's left arm. The skin parted. Dark red blood welled up and began to flow into the porcelain bowl held beneath. Washington watched his own blood leave his body. He did not look away. To him, this was the cure. But the flow was too slow for his liking. He believed the bad blood needed to rush out to relieve the inflammation. "The orifice is not large enough," Washington whispered, urging the overseer to cut deeper, to widen the wound. "More," Rawlins obeyed. The blood flowed faster. This was the first cut. They took about 12 to 14 ounces of blood, nearly a pint. In a modern hospital, losing a pint of blood is a significant event, usually reserved for blood donation by a healthy person. For a 67-year-old man fighting a severe bacterial infection, dehydrated and struggling to breathe, it was the first nail in the coffin. The bleeding did nothing. The hydraulic theory failed. The throat did not open. The inflammation did not subside. In fact, the loss of blood volume likely caused his blood pressure to drop, making his heart work harder to pump oxygen to his starving brain. By 9 a.m., the first physician arrived. Dr. James Craik was Washington's oldest friend. They had ridden together in the French and Indian War. They had stood together at Monongahela. Craik loved Washington like a brother. He entered the room, took one look at his friend, and his heart surely sank. He saw the classic signs of Synantia trachealis, the killer of the throat. He saw the way Washington sat, leaning forward to keep the airway open, the tripod position. He heard the strider. Craik was a man of his time. He knew only one way to fight such a violent enemy, with even more violence. If the first bleeding hadn't worked, it was because they hadn't taken enough. If the body was fighting, they had to break it to save it. He ordered a second bleeding, and then he escalated the torture. He ordered a blister of cantharides. This is where the story shifts from medical tragedy to medical horror. Cantharides is a powder made from crushed, dried blister beetles, emerald green insects that secrete a toxic chemical called cantharidin. When applied to the skin, it causes chemical burns. The theory was counter-irritation. By creating a massive fluid-filled blister on the outside of the throat, the doctors believed they could draw out the inflammation from the inside. They smeared the toxic paste onto Washington's neck. The sensation was a specific kind of hell. He was suffocating. He was dizzy from blood loss. And now the chemical paste began to eat into his skin, raising a large weeping blister. His neck felt as if it were on fire. The pain must have been excruciating, a searing heat wrapped around his throat like a collar of fire. Washington bore it without a groan. He sat by the fire, his neck bandaged and burning, his arm throbbing from the lancet cuts, his breath coming in shallow, desperate whistles. He was the perfect patient. He did exactly what he was told. He offered his arm for the blade. He offered his throat for the beetles. He trusted these men. He trusted the science. But the science was killing him. As the morning wore on, Washington's condition deteriorated. The lack of oxygen was making him restless. He couldn't lie down flat or he would choke. He couldn't sit up straight or he would faint. He was trapped in a twilight zone of air hunger. Dr. Craik, realizing he was losing the battle, sent for reinforcements. He summoned Dr. Gustavus Brown and Dr. Elisha Dick. He needed help. He needed someone to tell him he wasn't killing his best friend. But while they waited for the other doctors to arrive, Craik decided to try another remedy. He ordered Washington to gargle with a mixture of vinegar and sage tea. Washington tried. He took a mouthful. He threw his head back. But the muscles of the throat were paralyzed by infection and pain. He gagged. He choked. The fluid spilled down his chin, mixing with the sweat and the saliva he could no longer swallow. He looked at Craik with eyes full of sorrow and exhaustion. He shook his head slowly. He couldn't do it. The indestructible man was failing the simplest test of life, drinking a cup of tea. The room was filling up now. Martha sat in the corner, silent, terrified, watching the man who had been the rock of her life crumble. The servants moved like ghosts, bringing towels, bringing water, carrying away bowls of blood. The atmosphere was heavy with the smell of sickness, vinegar, burning wood, and the metallic tang of blood. The stage was set for the arrival of the younger doctors and the great debate that would seal Washington's fate. The torture protocol was about to enter its most brutal phase. By mid-afternoon on December 14th, the bedroom at Mount Vernon had transformed from a sick room into a battlefield of medical ideologies. The air was heavy, hot, and smelled of sickness, vinegar, and the metallic copper tang of blood. The fire roared in the hearth, keeping the room at a stifling temperature, while outside the winter sun began its slow descent behind the Virginia hills. Two more doctors had arrived to join Dr. Craik. The first was Dr. Gustavus Brown, a respected traditional physician who, like Craik, was steeped in the old ways of medicine. The second was Dr. Elisha Dick. He was young, only 37, sharp, ambitious, and trained in the newer, more radical schools of medical thought. Here, over the gasping body of George Washington, a dramatic confrontation took place that would determine the fate of the nation's father. It was a clash between the past and the future, between the safety of tradition and the terror of innovation. Dr. Dick looked at the patient. He saw what the older doctors refused to see. He saw a man who was mechanically obstructed. The infection in Washington's throat had turned the epiglottis into a swollen ball of flesh, plugging the windpipe like a cork in a bottle. Bleeding would not move the cork. Blistering would not move the cork. Dick turned to the senior physicians and proposed a procedure that was, in 1799, the medical equivalent of a moon landing. He suggested a tracheotomy. "We must cut the trachea," Dick argued, his voice urgent. He proposed slicing through the rings of cartilage below the blockage to create a new artificial airway. It would bypass the swollen throat entirely, allowing air to rush directly into the starving lungs. It was a violent, bloody solution, but it was the only thing that made physiological sense. "He is suffocating," Dick pleaded. "We must give him air." Dr. Craik and Dr. Brown were horrified. To them, slicing open the throat of the former president was butchery. It was too risky. It was unproven. What if they cut an artery? What if he died under the knife? They would be known forever as the men who murdered George Washington. "We must stick to the established methods," Craik insisted. The weight of hierarchy crushed the young doctor's innovation. The senior doctors overruled him. They would not cut the throat. Instead, they would double down on the only weapon they trusted, the lancet. They prepared for the fourth bleeding. This moment is the medical nadir of the 18th century. Washington was already weak. He had been bled 3 times. He had been unable to swallow water or food for nearly 12 hours. He was dehydrated, feverish, and exhausted. A modern physician would be setting up an IV line to add fluids. Craik and Brown prepared to take more out. They tied the tourniquet around his arm. The vein, collapsed and abused, was found. The lancet flashed in the firelight. In this single session, they drained 32 ounces of blood, a full quart. Combine this with the previous bleedings, and the math becomes terrifying. In less than 12 hours, they had removed roughly 80 ounces of blood, nearly 2.5 liters. That is 40 to 50% of the total blood volume of an adult male. As the blood flowed into the porcelain bowl, the doctors noted a chilling change. In the morning, the blood had rushed out, bright red and pressurized, the sign of a strong heart and high volume. Now it flowed slowly. It was dark, almost black. It was thick and viscous like tar. This wasn't bad blood. This was sludge. Washington's body was so depleted of fluid that his blood was literally thickening in his veins. His heart was pumping mud. He was entering hypovolemic shock. His extremities were growing cold not just from the fever, but because there wasn't enough blood to reach them. Washington watched this slow, dark river leave his body with an eerie detachment. He did not protest. In fact, earlier in the day, when the blood flowed too slowly for his liking, he had been the one to whisper, "More." He was a willing participant in his own execution, driven by the same stoic discipline that had won the war. He believed in the experts. He believed in the duty of the patient to endure. But the torture protocol wasn't finished. Having drained him of his life force, the doctors decided to assault his digestive system. They administered calomel, mercury chloride. It was a heavy metal poison used as a purgative. They followed it with tartar emetic, a chemical designed to induce violent vomiting. The logic was medieval. Purge the body of toxins from every orifice. The reality was torture. Washington's body, already screaming for oxygen and water, was racked with induced vomiting and diarrhea. He was being chemically assaulted from the inside while being drained from the outside. He sat in his chair, or was propped up in bed, enduring the spasms of his own stomach, the burning of the blister on his neck, and the slow graying of his vision as his brain starved for oxygenated blood. Through it all, he remained lucid. This is the most heartbreaking detail. He did not rave. He did not hallucinate. He was fully, terrifyingly awake. He knew exactly what was happening. He felt the life draining out of him, drop by drop, breath by shallow breath. Around 4:30 p.m., the indestructible man made a decision. He realized that the doctors were not saving him. They were just making his death harder. He called Martha to his bedside. He asked for his two wills. He reviewed them, his hands trembling, but his mind clear. He told her to burn the old one and keep the new one. He watched as she threw the old document into the fire. He was settling his accounts. He was closing the ledger. Then he turned to Dr. Craik. He looked at his old friend, the man who had just drained him white, with eyes that held no anger, only a profound, exhausted resignation. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the roar that had rallied the troops at Princeton. "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go. I die hard." It was a statement of fact. He was fighting for every breath. His body, so strong, so stubborn, was refusing to shut down, prolonging the agony. He was locked in a cage of physical suffering. "I believed from the first that the disorder would be fatal," he continued, gasping between words. "My breath cannot last long. I pray you to take no more trouble about me. Let me go off quietly." It was a plea for mercy. "Stop helping me. Stop bleeding me. Just let me die." The doctors, shamed and helpless, finally stepped back. They put away the lancets. They put away the vinegar. They sat in the shadows of the room, watching the sun go down, realizing too late that they had lost. Washington lay back against the pillows. The struggle was entering its final phase. The Red River had stopped flowing, but the fear was not gone. As the twilight deepened into the long night of December 14th, a new terror gripped the dying man, a terror not of death, but of the grave itself. The sun had vanished. The room was now a cave of shadows, lit only by the flickering hearth and the candles that cast long, dancing shapes against the walls. The doctors had retreated into the background, defeated sentinels watching the fortress fall. The violence of the day, the flashing lancets, the burning beetles, the retching, had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the laboring breath of the dying man, a rhythmic, wet rasp that marked the seconds of his final hour. George Washington lay still. The struggle for air had exhausted the last reserves of his immense strength, but as the darkness deepened, a final macabre anxiety gripped his mind. It was not a fear of judgment. He was at peace with his God. It was a primal Gothic fear that haunted the nightmares of the 18th century, taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. In an era before electronic monitors or reliable definitions of brain death, it was not uncommon for the comatose to be mistaken for the dead. Stories circulated of scratched coffin lids and bodies found turned over in their graves. For a man who had spent his life in absolute control of his physical environment, the idea of waking up in the suffocating darkness of a coffin was the ultimate horror. He summoned his secretary, Tobias Lear, to the bedside. Washington's voice was now barely a breath, a faint vibration in the ruined throat. Lear had to lean in close, his ear almost touching the general's lips to catch the words. "I am just going," Washington whispered. "Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." He paused, gasping for air, his eyes locking onto Lear's with an intensity that burned through the fever. "Do you understand me?" Lear, choking back tears, could not speak. He simply nodded. Washington was not satisfied. He needed verbal confirmation. He needed a contract. "Do you understand me?" he repeated, the command sharp and clear despite the whisper. "Yes," Lear managed to say. Washington closed his eyes. The tension left his face. "'Tis well," he breathed. He had secured his final perimeter. He would not wake up in the dark. The clock on the mantel chimed 10. The end was imminent. And here, in the final minutes of his life, George Washington performed one last act of supreme self-control that defines his character more than any battle he ever fought. He stopped moving his legs. He stopped thrashing. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his left hand and placed it on his right wrist. He was checking his own pulse. The discipline required was immense, even while suffocating, with his blood turning to sludge and his throat a ball of fire. His mind remained the objective surveyor to the very end. He was monitoring the collapse of his own machinery. He was measuring the fading rhythm of the indestructible man. The fingers rested on the wrist. 1 beat, 2, weak, thready, gone. The hand slipped from the wrist and fell limp onto the chest. It was between 10 and 11 o'clock on the night of December 14th, 1799. The breathing stopped. There was no final struggle, no dramatic speech, just a cessation of the noise. The giant machine simply ran out of fuel. Martha, who had been sitting at the foot of the bed, froze. She looked at Dr. Craik. The doctor placed his hand gently over Washington's eyes, closing them for the last time. "Is he gone?" Martha asked, her voice steady, devoid of the hysteria that had marked her earlier years. Lear nodded silently. "'Tis well," she said, echoing her husband's final words. "All is now over. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." The room was still. The father of his country was a corpse. But the story does not end with the closing of his eyes. It ends with the opening of his will. In the days that followed, as the nation plunged into a grief so profound, it paralyzed the government. The lawyers unsealed Washington's final testament. And there, amidst the distribution of land and swords, was a bombshell that would echo through history. George Washington, the slave owner who had bought teeth from his own chattel, the man who had pursued runaway slaves with relentless efficiency, had done something no other slave-holding founding father would do. He ordered the emancipation of his slaves. It was a complicated, delayed emancipation, to take effect only after Martha's death, but it was there. It was a final tortured admission of guilt. It was an acknowledgement that the empire of liberty he had built was flawed at its foundation. In death, he tried to fix what he could not fix in life. He tried to break the cycle of control and ownership that had defined his existence. History remembers the marble statue. It remembers the face on the dollar bill, stern, distant, impenetrable. Schools teach of the cherry tree and the crossing of the Delaware. But the truth is far more visceral. The enduring image is not the general on the white horse. It is the old man lying in a dark room, his throat bandaged, his arms scarred by cuts, his body drained white. It is the man checking his own pulse as the lights go out. He died hard, so the nation could live easy. He suffered the torture of the old world's medicine, leaving us a legacy that would eventually grow into the new world's freedom. The indestructible man was destroyed, but the experiment he protected, the fragile, messy, beautiful experiment of America, survived. And perhaps in the silence of that final night, as his hand fell from his wrist, That was enough.